Hey, can we give a round of applause to the band and all of them? That last song, man, yeah, thank you guys. Like, I have a history with that song, so I was over here actually crying a minute ago. So thank you so much for that blessing. This is going to fall off my ear. I apologize. I'm just going to talk like this the entire time this morning. Hey, let me go ahead and share a little bit about where I grew up and things that I experienced. So I grew up in a little town called Seymour, Tennessee. Most people have never heard of it. It sits squished between Gatlinburg and Knoxville, so we usually just tell people we're from Knoxville because it's easier to understand, because Seymour is so small, it's hard to find it on a map sometimes. But there was something about growing up in Seymour that was just true of everyone who grew up there. Like, you were, no doubt, you were a Tennessee Volunteer fan. Like, you're growing up next to Knoxville, you are going to be a Tennessee fan, which means you're going to hate anyone from Alabama. Clearly, I broke that rule a little bit. It also meant a couple other things, like the only person who is better than Dolly Parton and Peyton Manning is Jesus. Like, there's no one better than those two people, right, from where I'm from. It also meant that where I grew up, everyone called themselves a Christian even if they weren't, right? You were in the heart of the Bible Belt. There was a church on every street corner. Many churches shared the same parking lot, which I have no idea how that works. And that was the common thing. You called yourself a Christian, even if you're like, man, I only go to church maybe once every few years, or you call yourself a Christian just because you're like, I'm a nice person, so I must be a Christian. And that was the general atmosphere of growing up in the Bible Belt. In fact, in some cases, I knew guys who were like, I don't believe in this at all, but I'm going to call myself a Christian so that the Christians don't come and hound me and beat me over the head with the Bible, right? So all the time growing up, when I was like, God, I know you are calling me into ministry. I know you want me to pastor a church. Here's my list, God, of where I want to be. I want to be either in New England, the Southwest, or send me to Africa, but do anything but don't send me to the Bible Belt. So we end up in Southeast Missouri in the Bible Belt, right? And I don't mean that to bash anything. Like, we are so incredibly thrilled that our plan was not God's plan, that God had a different mindset. But honestly, we were sitting there like, here, God, here's my plan. If you could just make my plan work, trust me, my plan is going to be so good. Like, how many of you have ever done that before with God, right? Like, for us, that's where we were. And I'm so glad that we were wrong, because otherwise we wouldn't be here. And our heart is to be here indefinitely. Like, we have no plans of going anywhere else. But I say this to point out something that is still very similar in this community that I grew up in. For instance, if you grew up here and you're around here, I'm betting you're probably a Cardinals fan. Even if you don't watch baseball, even if you have no idea how baseball works, you're probably a Cardinals fan, right? Yes, okay? It also probably means that you have a great love for guns, hunting, or fishing if you grew up around here, right? Yeah, okay. And it also probably means the exact same thing that I saw with churches, is that you're easy to say, I'm a Jesus follower, right? And we do this all the time. We build up a list of things that says, this is why I'm a Jesus follower, because I go to a church, or because I would say I go to that church, even though you've never crossed into the doors of the church. Or you say, man, I'm a Jesus follower because I'm a nice person, and yeah, sure, I believe that Jesus was real and he did some cool things and stuff like that. See, we live in this world where it is so easy in this context to say that you're a Jesus follower. But the real question we should be asking, that's scary, that we oftentimes don't ask because it's uncomfortable, is, what does Jesus say it means to truly follow him? If the guy is going around calling people in the first century world saying, come follow me, he should be the one to define what that looks like, not us 2,000 years later. And the things that Jesus said are really uncomfortable. And so this is why sometimes we don't actually read what Jesus says, what it means to follow him, because that means that Jesus might have some authority on how we live our lives. That he might actually say, hey man, there's some changes that need to happen here for this to be real. He might look at the list of things that we bring up and say, Jesus, I'm a Jesus follower because, I don't drink, or I don't smoke, or I don't have too many tattoos, or I have certain sexual behavior. And if that was the case, then I think a lot of us would be out, right? But this is what we do. We say, hey, I'm doing good on a certain list, and so therefore I'm a Jesus follower. We don't usually ask the question, man, what did Jesus have to say? Well, Jesus was very blunt. He was very clear on what it means to follow him, and it's really uncomfortable. It's found in Luke chapter 9. One of his biographers records Jesus saying this, and read this with me. It's Luke chapter 9, verse 23. Jesus says, if anyone, meaning anyone, man, woman, child, white, black, Republican, Democrat, American, Russian, you're from Poplar Bluff or even Jackson. I know some of you are shocked by that. He says, if anyone would come after me, and if anyone is wanting to be a follower of Jesus, here's what it looks like. Let him deny himself. Well, that feels really uncomfortable, right? Well, he goes on, and he gets worse, and he says, and take up his cross daily. You know what happens when people are on a cross? They die, right? They get humiliated, they get tortured, and then they die. He's like, take up his cross daily and follow me. Like, there's nothing about what Jesus said there that's comfortable. He's not saying, hey, guess what, guys? If you follow me, you're going to have all the health and wealth and happiness you could ever possibly want. Come, join me. He's like, no, man, this is difficult. This involves sacrifice. This involves devotion. This involves committing yourself to something that is bigger than you, that matters more than you, that's going to outlive you, and that's for what is good. But it's not easy. And to follow this causes for some real life change. A pastor who's much smarter than me and says it much better, a guy named Kyle, I like reading his work, he says it like this. He says it is much easier to speak about following Jesus when you are making a general statement about any specific commitments, without any specific commitments. But the most obvious and basic definition of following Jesus will mean making some significant life changes. See, Jesus isn't giving some just general statements here. He's being very clear. He's like, if you want to be a follower, it's going to cause some changes. And so that's why we're doing this series called Weighing the Cost, because we're not looking for people just to say, yeah, I'm a Jesus follower. We want to find the definition of what Jesus says it means to follow him. And here's what's the honest truth about this series. There's some of you that you're going to be really uncomfortable with this series. And there's some of you who are going to be like, man, if we're asking these questions, you're going to look at it and you're like, man, I don't know if I am truly a Jesus follower. There's some of you who are like, I don't want to be part of this. Some of you might not come back to church. Some of you might leave your faith. But here's what I'm really hoping. I'm not saying all this to discourage you. I'm hoping that for the majority of us, we'll sit there and think, yes, Jesus is worth it. And yes, I'm going to follow him. And yes, I'm going to live my life as him as the king. And I'm walking with him. And good things happen when that happens. And right after Jesus lays it out, saying, here's what it means to follow him, he has three individuals who come and talk to him, who have the opportunity of a lifetime to follow him. And all three choose that Jesus is not worth it when he tells them what the cost is. And they weigh it. And they think, man, Jesus is not worth following if he means this. And so for the next 3 weeks, we're going to look at each one of their stories. And we're going to ask some serious questions about ourselves. And my hope, like I said, is that through this, man, we might be challenged, we might be encouraged, and the community around you will see a clear difference when you say yes to Jesus. But before we get into that, would you just join me in a word of prayer right now? Jesus, my heart to you is yes, even before the question gets asked, because I know you are worth it. But I do ask, as we start to wrestle with some serious questions here in the next little bit, that you would speak through me, that your Holy Spirit might move amongst our midst, that you might touch our hearts, you might nudge us. There might be people in this room who you have just an amazing amount of potential and purpose that you've invested in them, and you're just waiting for them to say yes to you so that they might go and change lives around them for the better. And I pray that through this series, as we are weighing the cost of following you, man, that it might result in true life change amongst us, amongst our church, and amongst our community. It's in your name I pray. Amen. The first occurrence that we're going to be looking at occurs also in Luke chapter 9. It's verse 57, where this guy comes up and he says this to Jesus. It says, as they were going along the road, someone said to him, I will follow you wherever you go. which this sounds awesome. This sounds brave. This guy's like, hey, Jesus, I like what you're selling. I like what you're doing. I like all the impact you're having around this community, and I want a piece of it. Jesus, I'm on board. I'm following you. Where you go, I go. And this sounds great. We would even admire it. We'd be like, man, I like this guy. This is a guy who knows Jesus. He sees all the potential in Jesus, and he wants a slice of the cake. And then Jesus responds by saying this, and it's really uncomfortable. Very next verse, Jesus said to him, foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests. So he says, look around. Everything around you has some sort of comfort, some place where they can rest their head, some place of safety. And here's what he says instead. He says, but the Son of Man, which is the way he likes to refer to himself, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Now, once again, we can see that Jesus isn't sugarcoating things. Like, he isn't playing around. He's like, let me give you the worst sales pitch in history, right? Like Mel, you're a businessman, you're a banker. Imagine if when you were starting out, before anyone told you all the good things that you could do, they're like, hey, how would you like to work a job where you're dealing with all the mess and drama of an office? You're going to be helping, not really helping people, but maybe you'll be helping out with getting people something, and then they're just going to fail and flop, and they're not going to commit. Like, if someone just pitched to you all the bad things and never told you anything good, and then stopped and says, do you still want a slice of this? Like anyone, you probably like, okay, hold off, right? I need to know that there's some good things. Yeah, see you later, right? And that's what Jesus does. He's like, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. I'm not going to give you all the good stuff. He's like, let me tell you how bad this can be. It's uncomfortable. He's like, look, guys, I'm living in tents. I'm moving around. I'm being hunted. And the same could happen to all of my disciples. There's no palace that we're building right here on this earth. There's nothing that we're trying to earn our financial status. He's like, you're following me, and you might not be rich. Am I still worth it? Right? Like, this gives a little bit of pause because this guy, Jesus, is presenting the most uncomfortable thing he knows this guy is not ready for. This guy says, man, I want to follow you, Jesus. And Jesus is like, what about this really uncomfortable aspect over here? And honestly, that makes us stop a lot of times as well because we like our comfort. We like our security. I mean, this is why for some of you, maybe you don't want to get baptized. You're like, man, that's a little bit uncomfortable. I'll be in front of people. Maybe for some of you, you're like, I don't want to serve in the For the City because that means on my Saturday morning, rather than sleeping in, I might actually, have to do something good and positive for the community. For some of you, this is why you don't serve in anywhere or serve in your home. For some of you, this is why you don't give in the offering buckets when they go around, because it's uncomfortable to trust God with your finances, right? But here is what we need to learn. Following Jesus means trusting him with what makes us uncomfortable. It means trusting him with what makes us uncomfortable. Let me give you some word pictures to show this. So you probably have heard this story of a guy named Jonah. If you haven't, it's pretty cool. He got eaten by fish. It's really cool. All right, like Pinocchio. But before that ever happened, God told Jonah, he's like, Jonah, you see the Ninevites over there, the people that, you're having some political conflict with as a nation, you're probably going to go to war with them rather soon. Here's what I want you to do, Jonah. I want you to go to them, and I want you to preach the gospel. And Jonah's sitting there nodding his head, and he's like, okay, I'm going to go in the opposite direction as fast as I can, because I'm getting away from that, right? And that is so true of our human nature when God's like, hey, what about this? And we're like, yeah, but what about that instead, right? All right? And I think in heart, though, we don't want to think of ourselves as Jonah. I think in heart, we want to think of ourselves more of a guy named Isaiah. Now, if you've ever grown up in church, or if you ever went to a youth camp or youth conference, no doubt you heard about Isaiah. Because every convention, every youth camp I've ever been to, someone always talks about Isaiah and his encounter with God in Isaiah chapter 6. So here's what happens. Isaiah gets this vision from God where God speaks to Isaiah. And God's kind of moping on his throne, and it says, and I heard the voice of Yahweh saying, whom shall I send and who will go for us? It's God looking at the world, and he's like, this is broken. I've got to have someone step up and help out. And here's Isaiah. He's like, here I am, send me, right? Maybe you've heard that message. Maybe you had some evangelist or some preacher told you, hey, who here will say, here I am, send me? And you maybe even rose your hand and you're like, yes, I want to go where God wants me to go. And I'll be honest, I've heard those sermons. And I've heard those conventions. And I was the kid who rose my hand all the time. But I realized when I got older, no one said what God said next. Right? Because God, he gets this guy, Isaiah, who volunteers and says, hey, I want to be part of your mission, God. I want to be on board with you. I want to do what you do. And here's what God says. Very next verse. And God said to him, go and say to this people, keep on hearing, but do not understand. Keep on seeing, but do not perceive. Here's what God's telling Isaiah. He's like, Isaiah, thank you so much for volunteering. I want you to go and preach the gospel, and I want you to know no one will ever listen to you. You're not going to have any converts. No one's going to buy into what you're selling. In fact, people will get annoyed by what you're saying, that they'll eventually start to fire you from jobs, and then eventually your own people will turn on you, they'll betray you, they will kill you. You still on board? Right? Like, this is the ultimate, Isaiah, I know you want to be a success, but you're going to be a failure. And I'll be honest, I would wrestle with that a lot if God was like, hey, I got something great for you. It's to lose, to fail. I don't know about you, but I'd wrestle with that. Imagine if God told you, said, hey, I want you to go home and I want you to share the gospel with your kids. Or I want you to share it with your family, and I want you to share it with your friends. I want you to share it with your coworkers, and do it knowing they'll never listen to you. Would you still do it? See, that's what Jesus is telling this guy in Luke chapter 9. When this guy's like, hey, Jesus, I want to follow you, and Jesus is like, this isn't going to be pleasant for you. He's pointing and he's like, what about there? Would you follow me there, even if it means failure, even if it means discomfort, even if it means losing? Would you follow me there? And I think we all have a what about there when we come to follow Jesus. What if God is pointing at you and you're like, man, I'm a Jesus follower, I want to follow Jesus. And what if Jesus is pointing at you and says, what about at your home? Will you go back to your home and seek to serve rather than be served? Will you seek to be patient rather than demanding? Would you seek to be encouraging rather than criticizing? What if God was to point at your work and said, what about there? When you clock into work, do you clock out of your faith? What if God was to say, what about at your school? Are you seeking to be an encourager? Are you seeking to stand up for the weak and the bullied? Or do you hide a little bit when it's uncomfortable to follow Jesus? What about at the ball field? When you're rooting for your kid on the other side of the fence, do the parents around you, can they look and you're like, that's a Jesus follower? Or they're like, man, I sure hope that person doesn't go to church. And if they do, I'm not going to their church, right? Please don't let people know that you go to the Bluff Church if that's you, okay? So what about there? Because in truth, we all have a what about there. Where it seems like Jesus points to the one place where we're like, Jesus, please don't look at this thing over here. I'll follow you everywhere, but don't point at to my community. Don't point at my neighborhood. Don't point at that people group. Don't point at another nation. Don't point where I don't want you to point, Jesus. But here's what it truly means to be a follower of Jesus, and I can't make this any simpler than what Jesus is saying. It's that being a follower of Jesus means going where Jesus goes. Being a follower of Jesus means going where Jesus goes. Where Jesus goes is oftentimes uncomfortable. Where he goes is oftentimes inconvenient to us. But it's when we lay down our comforts to gain an uncomfortable God that we find often the places where we were always meant to be. And we find the opportunities to be who God has always made us to be. And I know I struggle with this as well, so I'm not throwing anyone under the bus. But I find those moments when I feel like God is kind of nudging me in the ribs a little bit, saying, hey, what about there? Would you go there right now? I always have this family that pops in my mind that's always inspired me. It's the family known as Adoram and Anna Judson. You maybe have heard of them, maybe have not. They're an awesome family. Here's what happened with them. They were the very first missionaries in America 200 years ago. And Adoram, when he was 24, God laid it on his heart to go to Burma, to convert or to translate the Bible from English into Burmese, so the people of Burma could hear the word of God in their own language. But the problem was Burma was not a safe place to be a Christian. It was violent against the gospel. And so to go to Burma meant certain death. And Adoram, a 24-year-old, he's like, man, that's what God has called me to do, and that's where I'm going. But he had this issue where he was engaged and in love with a woman named Anna. And he did not choose one or the other. He asked Anna, he's like, Anna, would you please come with me on this journey, knowing it's probably going to end in both of us being killed? And he knows, can you imagine, like, as a father, and you have this boy who comes and starts dating your daughter, and is like, hey, here's my plans for my future. Like, I would be having a hard time if someone came like that around my daughter one day, right? But Adoram wrote this letter to his father-in-law before they got married, asking for permission to have Anna come and join him in Burma. And here's what he wrote, and it's beautiful. Can you imagine as a father getting this kind of letter from someone who wants to marry your daughter? Here's what he said. He says, I have now to ask whether you can consent to part with your daughter early next spring, to see her no more in this world. Whether you can consent to her departure and her subjugation to the hardships and sufferings of missionary life. Whether you can consent to her exposure to the dangers of the ocean, to the fatal influence of the southern climate of India, to every kind of want and distress, to degradation, insult, persecution, and perhaps a violent death. Can you consent to all this for the sake of him who left his heavenly home and died for her and for you, for the sake of perishing immortal souls, for the sake of Zion and the glory of God? Can you consent to all this in hope of soon meeting your daughter in the world of glory with the crown of righteousness? Wow. Fathers, can you imagine getting that letter, right? I mean, like, we struggle to get people to volunteer in kids ministry or VBS. And he's asking, right? He's asking for this guy to give permission and his blessing to never see his daughter again. Now, this father, he's like, my daughter she's an adult. I'm going to let her make that decision. And so Anna, as she's wrestling with this, she writes to her friend Lydia about her response and what she decides to do. And here's what she wrote. She says, I feel willing and expect, if nothing in providence prevents, to spend my days in this world in heathen lands. Yes, Lydia, I have about come to the determination to give up all my comforts and enjoyments here, sacrifice my affection to relatives and friends, and go where God and his providence shall see fit to place me. So in 1813, Anna and Adoram got married, hopped on a ship, and went to Burma. And it was incredibly dangerous and uncomfortable for them. In fact, within 10 years of them landing in Burma, Adoram gets arrested. And he spends his nights in prison where they hang him by his ankles from the ceiling, and he's in the cell that's 110 degrees, and it's filled with mosquitoes, and he's there all night. And right when he got arrested and was put in prison, his wife Anna got pregnant. And despite being pregnant, she still walked 2 miles every single day to the courts to plead for her husband's release. And he was there for almost 2 years. So during that time, Anna has her baby, and they have a baby girl named Maria. But Anna gets sick and her milk dries up, and so Adoram is given permission to leave the prison at night, escorted by an armed guard, to go to village to beg for mothers to please feed his newborn child. And after almost 2 years in prison, he finally gets cleared and he comes home just in time for his wife Anna to die of spotted fever. Their story is incredibly difficult. It's incredibly uncomfortable, but here's what God did through it. Because of their efforts, the Burma people got the written word of God in their own language. And now there are over 3,700 churches that trace their heritage back to the Judsons and their sacrifice. And I think about that for us. That maybe that thing that you know that God wants you to do, where God's saying, hey, what about there? Would you go there with me? Maybe there's something good in it involved. It may not lead to 3,000 churches, but it might lead to one soul getting to know Jesus, and that's worth it. There's a passage I think Paul gives in relation to this in his letter to the Galatians. And we oftentimes either forget it or we read it as a sense of comfort. But I think it's really uncomfortable if you actually think about what he's saying. It's in Galatians chapter 2 where he says, I have been crucified with Christ. There's nothing comfortable about that. He says, I've been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. He's saying, here's where my allegiance lies. Here's who I take my orders from. Here's what I do. I follow my King because he died for me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God. It is difficult, my friends, to live by faith. To live by faith means that there's some doubt, that there's some uncertainty, that there's some discomfort. He says, I live now by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. Will you go wherever Jesus wants you to go? As part of this series, we're going to be doing something unique. I've got a treat for you guys. I have a couple of friends who are doing extraordinary things for Jesus, and I've asked them to give a little video testimony of what they're doing so that each week in this series, as we close out our message, you get to hear their story and what they're doing for Jesus. And I'm not saying this to judge or to compare them to any of us, just to say that maybe God has something he wants to do in your life. So this morning, you're going to hear from my friend Marissa. Jody and I met Marissa about a week after we got married when we started attending a church called Broadway Baptist Church when I was an intern there. Marissa was part of this group of young adults that we connected with well. At the time, she was a music teacher in an elementary school. And God, man, he worked through all those young adults, and many of them are in ministry and in a couple places around the world. I think Marissa went the furthest. She is in PNG. She joined up with a couple of people who planted a church there, who are translating the Bible, and they started a school, and she's a teacher there. So I want you to enjoy hearing her story, but let me go ahead and pray, and then Dave will play the video for us so you can meet my friend Marissa. Won't you pray with me? Jesus, we want to go wherever you are because we know wherever you are, even when it's difficult, even when it costs us something, we know it is good. We know it's good for us. We know it's good for others. We know it is part of your plan. And so, Father, I ask, would you give us the courage and the boldness to be uncomfortable this week, to hear your presence when you give us those little elbow nudges, that we might go wherever you want us to go. It's in your name I pray. Amen.
Hello, my name is Marissa Myers, and I'm really excited to be sharing a little bit with you guys today about what I get to do here in this beautiful place called Papua New Guinea. If you've never heard of it, it is slightly north of Australia, and I've lived here now for about 2.5 years. I was excited when Mason reached out to me a while back and asked me to share a little bit with you guys about what I do here. My job is I'm a missionary teacher, so I get to work at a place called Ramu Valley Academy every day with some of the most amazing students on the planet. This school kind of is unique. It came out of a Bush church plant that came up about 20 years ago. Bill and Kelly Housley have lived there for about the past 20 years, and they started to see a lot of growth in their church elders, but what they became concerned about was the second generation of the church. How are we going to, A, propel the people that are in the church now to lead and guide their own people, and then how are we going to equip them in order that they can still be going and reaching more of the unreached people here in Papua New Guinea? One of the hard things about growing in your faith here is that the education system, being what it is, it's not super great, and so the ability to read, the ability to reason through why things are happening, the ability to understand the world around you, the scientific reasons beneath it all, aren't there for a lot of the people here. And it's not because they're stupid, it's simply because they haven't been taught. And so our Ramu Valley Academy, the school that I work at, came out of a hope to equip and enable the next generation of saints to be strengthening the church that already exists and to be missionaries right here to their own people. And so that's kind of what I get to do every day. On the ground, I get to teach them math is my primary job, and I get to do some music with them too, which is really cool. And we've got other teachers who are teaching the other subjects. And it's pretty amazing just to watch and see how the Lord will use those things in their lives to grow them and to change them and to be making them think about who He is and understand Him as Creator a lot better. And then we also spend a lot of time with the students 24/7 just being able to disciple them. They live on the same campus that we do, and so oftentimes we'll see them in the evening, we'll take walks with them, we'll just discuss life things with them. We teach them a lot of different things about just what it looks like to walk a godly life and how we operate underneath the hand of our Father. And so getting to do that with them is a real blessing of this ministry. And so I know that the verses that you guys are going to be talking about are the ones that come from Luke. So I've got my Bible right here, and I just want to read the verse I think you guys are focusing on right now, Luke 9:23, that says, "And he said to all, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me." And that is really easy to read through. That is super simple for me to just sit here and say to you. And honestly, when I was feeling like this is where the Lord was leading me, the decision to come wasn't an overly hard one for me. Not that it didn't take some thought, not that it was just simple, but I knew so strongly that this is what he wanted me to do that I felt like, okay, that I can do. I think for me, the hardest thing about these verses, even here, even as a missionary, I have this cool title, and it may make you think like, oh, I bet she does a lot really easily and really well. Well, I'm just as much a sinner as I was before. I still have to fight that every day. That didn't change. And so I think the hardest part of this verse is really that daily choice of, and we often talk about here, dying to yourself 1,000 times a day. It's the 1,000 little deaths that are happening. And so I just wanted to story a little bit about how did I get here? And then what does it look like here? What does obedience look like? What does it look like when he says, deny yourself, take up your cross? So I've been here for about 2.5 years now. I had absolutely no intentions of becoming a missionary. I was teaching in the States. I had a really nice job, actually, teaching young students music at a school there in Tennessee. And I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed that. I enjoyed the people I worked with. It was a really nice atmosphere, a nice place to work. But about halfway through my second year teaching, I heard about RVA, and I don't think this is how it happens for everyone, but as soon as I heard about it, I knew that this is what the Lord is calling me to do next. And so I didn't say anything to anyone because I kind of felt dumb. I was like, you can't just decide you're going to move halfway across the world in 1 minute. So I just kept my mouth shut, and I prayed about it for the next year, and just asked the Lord to either take it off of my heart, make it something I don't feel drawn to anymore, or draw me closer to it and let me know that it is the path he wants me to walk. And throughout the next year, I thought about it over and over and over many, many times, continuously prayed through it. And then when I heard about it again, the same missionaries came back to our church and talked about it. It was something that I needed to follow in then. This is when that step of him asking me to do something had to become obedience. It wasn't really a choice necessarily. It was, but it wasn't. I knew that's what he was asking me to do. And so that's what that looked like for me. It doesn't look like that for everyone, but that is one way I think that the Lord asks us to be obedient. Sometimes he does ask you to move a long ways and to do something kind of drastic. But sometimes he's not asking me to do that at all. He doesn't ask me to do it again every day while I'm here, but he does still ask me to be obedient. And I told you I'm the math teacher here, so words are not always my strong suit. So I wrote down a few thoughts that I have, so forgive me as I read some of these, but I just wanted to kind of read some of these as reflections on these verses and maybe what that looks like in my daily life and what it looks like in the life of a believer as we all, myself included, continue to work towards obedience. So here I go. I heard a sermon recently and a new thought struck me. So many times in our childhood or in a movie, you get rewarded for doing the right hard thing. The child obeys and waits on whatever his parents told him to. Okay, well, here's your cookie for waiting. Husband stays at home and takes care of the kids instead of going out with his friends. Okay, his wife makes him a nice dinner. But this isn't at all what Jesus has promised us. Not on this ground. He has promised us that there will be a cost to obedience. Not maybe, but for sure. And obedience doesn't just happen. We are selfish, sinful creatures. Sometimes he's asking you to move a long ways. Sometimes he's asking you just to talk to the person next to you. Sometimes he's asking you to leave space. Sometimes he's asking you to leave things behind. Sometimes he's asking you to draw close to something. Sometimes he's asking you to walk away from things that are good, but maybe things that are going to hold you back from running the race well that he wants you to be running. Usually, obedience does mean walking away from everything that makes you feel safe and comfortable. So why do it? If it doesn't sound fun, if it doesn't sound easy, why would we do it? Why obey? Why take on a cost, right? Why would I accept this? If I know that the Lord is asking me to deny myself and to take up my cross, why would I accept a cost there? Because Jesus then, in those costs, he promises more of himself to those who obey. And that is a gift that is much bigger than anything in this world. Even if I got everything I wanted in this world, I can sit here and think about all the things that I would love to have. I can sit here and think about what I think would make me happy. And even if I got every single one of those, reality is I would want the next thing again and again and again and again. And so I can either spend my life pursuing all of those things in disobedience to the Lord, or I can turn my back on all of those and count the cost of leaving them behind. Some of them are good things, but I count the cost because I know that the reward I get for obedience, the reward I get for following Christ, is to know him more. And that's something that nothing in this world can take away, and it actually satisfies. It is a much better thing to count this cost and have life. If you read some of those next verses in Luke right there, these are the ones that say, whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. And so just thinking through some of that, why, if you're struggling with obedience, sometimes I think it's important to ask that question, why would I do it? Why would I count the cost if it is one? Why do something that isn't fun, that isn't easy? Well, it's to have something that's so much greater. And so I think Mason was saying that he's going to ask some questions like, will we go if the Lord calls us to go? Will I do what he's telling me to do when he tells me to do it? And as I thought through that, those are challenging questions. It would be really easy just to sit and be like, yeah, I for sure will. But if you change that question just a little bit and ask, do you believe that he is greater than anything he asked you to leave behind? I think that may be some of the root of why we don't always go when he says go, and why we don't do it when he says to do it, because we're afraid of what we have to leave behind. And so just thinking through those things today. And I want to leave you with one encouragement, and I'm going to read this again, but it says, consider everything you've ever wanted in this world. Are you satisfied with it, or are you still left wanting? Isn't having more of Jesus, who promises to be eternally satisfying, worth leaving behind unsatisfying things? Recently, I was sharing a struggle I was having with a mentor, a friend of mine, and her response was 2 simple words, and that's what I'll leave you with. When he calls you to do the next thing, risk it.